Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's great to see so many people here. A very quick introduction of myself. My name's Chris Ryder. I work as the Executive Director of CPAWS Yukon. I've been really lucky to be in the position for the last 5 years, which makes this my third federal leadership or federal forum, which is kind of exciting. Maybe this one was a little sooner than I think we expected, but I think it should still be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really a privilege for me to be able to acknowledge this evening the fact that we're hosting the event here in Whitehorse and that we're on the traditional territory of Kwanlindun First Nation and the Ta'an Kwachung Council. I think it's always important to speak meaningfully when you're doing a land acknowledgement. And I know that I feel such a profound sense of gratitude that I have the opportunity to live and work in just such an incredible place. And I feel grateful for that every day. With that, I'd now like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Angela Code. Angela will be leading you through tonight's event. I think I'm just really excited to have her be part of this. So with that, Angela, it's over to you. Thank you so much. And you're muted.
I'm so sorry, guys. It's been a night of technical difficulties. But hello, Whatsia, Angela Code, Husia, Saisi Dana Hesley, Tessa Uli Twe, Hotzin, Whitehorse, Kwanlin Nasted, Sinyasi Masi. My name is Angela Code, and I'm a proud member of the Saisi Dene First Nation. I'm originally from Tuduli Lake, Manitoba, but Whitehorse, Yukon, Kwanlin has been my home for over 20 years, and I love it here. I'm a proud Northerner, and I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say tonight about leading our territory and representing who we are as Northern people. So thank you very much for inviting me to moderate tonight. This is fairly new to me, so bear with me if I stumble a little bit, but I'm really excited and happy to be here. So Masi, thank you. All right, well, we might as well jump right into it. Our candidates tonight are Jonas Smith, who's representing himself in the Independent Party, Liberal Party, Dr. Brendan Hanley, Green Party, Lenore Morris, NDP, Lisa Volans Leduc, and unfortunately, Barbara Dunlop is not available for tonight. So this event will be recorded and posted to YouTube afterwards, and the link can be found through CPAWS Yukon and the Yukon Conservation Society. It is also being live streamed via Facebook. So hi to everyone watching. I hope you enjoyed tonight, and a few rules and requests for the candidates. Please be respectful and don't interrupt other representatives when they're speaking. We'll try to do our best to stick to the schedule, and please try to stick to your allotted times to answer questions. You'll hear a bell when 30 seconds remain. It sounds like this. Is someone gonna ring the bell? Chris?
It seems like we're having a minor technical difficulty.
Okay. Were you guys able to hear that?
Very, very quietly.
Okay. Great. Okay, so I heard that bell. Hopefully you guys also heard that. So that will be the bell that you hear when 30 seconds remain. And another bell when your time is up sounds like this. Great. Okay. So try to avoid using acronyms while you're speaking. And we will use a question and answer format. This is not an open debate. However, you can use your 2 minutes to respond to earlier responses. At the overview of the evening, so we will do opening remarks and each candidate will have 1 minute to introduce themselves. And the opening questions come from various Yukon organizations, groups, and the Council of Yukon First Nations. Candidates, you have seen these questions in advance of tonight's event. So you'll have 2 minutes to respond. And in order to be fair to all the candidates, we will randomly alternate the order for each question so that everyone has a chance to answer first and everyone has a chance to answer last. And then we will have questions from the public. And also people have sent these in beforehand, and people can also send in questions via the chat. Yeah, we will get to as many as we can depending on time. And yeah, we're just trying to cover a broad range of environmental issues that the Yukon faces. All righty. And then in the end, we'll do closing remarks. All right, is everybody ready to go? All right, great. Okay, so opening remarks. We will start with Dr. Hanley from the Liberal Party, and then Lisa Volans-Leduc from the NDP, Lenore Morris from the Green Party, and Jonas Smith, Independent. So firstly, Dr. Hanley, please give your opening remarks.
Hi, and please call me Brendan. I'm happy to be on first name basis. Greetings to everyone, and thanks for so many people attending this forum. It's a great chance to exchange some conversation and views. There are 3 main areas that motivate me to seek election. A focus on reconciliation, a focus on climate change action, and on mental health and addictions. Oh, okay, that's the first part. And we all know that whatever has been done before is not yet enough, particularly with climate change, and we need committed and accountable action. And that's what motivated me to put my name in for the Liberal Party candidate. I think I can bring a strong and experienced Northern voice to the national table and advocate for the needs and priorities of Yukoners. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. All right, next up we have Lisa Volans-Leduc.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for welcoming me here today and everyone that's watching. I have the privilege of living and working on the land of the original people, the Tagish-Kwan, and on the territories of the Kwalindun First Nation, Ta'ang Council, and Carcross Tagish First Nation. In Northern Canada, we have experienced climate change impacts 3 times greater than the rest of the world. Our planet is in a state of an emergency, and the NDP is determined to deliver actions, not just empty promises. When I first moved up here 18 years ago, we would have weeks of bitterly cold weather, like over 4 weeks of -30 or 40. July was the hottest month on record, and the world watched as hundreds died in BC due to increasing temperatures, and Lytton was completely decimated. This summer, the military was called to our territory to assist our families in sandbagging, to protect our homes, mine included. Communities from across the territory came in home out. My wife and I are forever grateful. These kinds of emergencies will be regular if we don't take action now to mitigate and adapt. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. Next up, we have Lenore Morris.
Hi, so I'm Lenore Morris. I'm running for the Green Party. I am intensely interested in environmental issues. That's why I'm running on behalf of the Green Party. The Green Party formed in Canada about 35 years ago, primarily because there were a number of people who felt that the other parties were not focusing nearly enough on the environment, that they were focusing largely on the economy and not enough on the environment. That's changed a lot, but it's still the case that we would say that it's not enough, that there's always this gap, that corporations and money seem to be always what leads the way. I'm a lawyer. I live here in Whitehorse. I have a deep roots here in the Yukon. I've got a sister and a son living in Dawson City. I'm an advocate. That's what my job is now, and I want to be an advocate for Yukoners.
Thank you, Lenore. And last but not least, we have Jonas Smith.
Thank you, Gwyneth. Merci. My name is Jonas. I'm running as an independent. I was a vegetarian for the better part of the first 25 years of my life, and I've been a Yukon vegetarian for the last almost 25. That means I eat only 100% organic, 100-mile diet, free range, all natural wild game meat. I spent 10 years of my life living off-grid in a small cabin in the Key River Valley, powered by solar power, getting water from the creek. I grew my own garden. But when I started having children, I had to start changing diapers. I figured running water was a pretty handy thing, so I moved to town. I currently live in Takini in a super green home with triple pane windows and electric heat, close to all amenities, so I don't have to drive very far. So I would gladly compare my carbon footprint with anyone. I like to believe that I practice what I preach, and I also support a strong Yukon resource economy. We all use the products it produces in our modern lives, and I think we can produce them here more responsibly than anywhere else in the world. And that way Yukoners can benefit from the jobs, but also from the environmental oversight. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. All right, we're going to move on to our first question. We asked 6 groups, each with an interest in nature and the environment, to provide a question for the candidates. Each party representative will be given 2 minutes to respond. This first question is coming from the Yukon Environmental Organization. And the order will be, firstly, Lenore Morris from the Green Party, second, Jonas Smith, Independent, Lisa Volans-Leduc, NDP, and lastly, Dr. Hanley from the Liberal Party. The first question is the first question is from the Yukon Conservation Society, a grassroots environmental nonprofit organization established in 1968 and one of the hosts of tonight's event. Their question is, the recently proposed Kadze Kaya mine would be situated in key habitat for the Finlayson caribou herd. If the mine is approved, it would threaten the existence of this woodland caribou herd, a species which is already considered vulnerable in the Yukon. This situation is not unique. With similar projects having decimated caribou across Canada, it is why so many herds across the country are now threatened or even extinct. If you had to choose between industrial development and the longevity of a caribou herd, which would you choose and why? And again, the first order is Lenore Morris.
So I'm going to say yes on that one, but I'm going to say a bit more too. So for those who don't know, this is a pretty unusual situation that arose recently. So first, the proposal was reviewed by YESAB, and since we're not using acronyms, it's the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board, and they actually deadlocked on this. They had made a recommendation that the project be allowed to proceed with a number of conditions attached to it, but they recognized that there was a threat that if it proceeded, that they could not completely mitigate the drawbacks to it, in particular to this Finlayson caribou herd. And this is one where the federal government ended up intervening and sort of sending it back. It's still in the process. So yes, of course I would choose the caribou, but this is a really unusual situation. And it's in the Casca region, which is an area where there's no land use planning process, and there's no land use planning process planned either, because those First Nations are not under the umbrella final agreement at this point. I would say for myself, species loss is probably the worst possible effect of climate change. So climate change is a serious problem. One of the things that's been happening globally is species loss. I'm aware of the caribou problems in some other places, in particular in British Columbia, about how, I mean, some of the herds are literally down to a handful of members and are being trucked into different places and kind of kept on little farms that can be kept alive. The biggest source of habitat loss is the species number loss is habitat loss.
Okay, thank you, Lenore. All right, next we have Jonas Smith. And if you'd like me to repeat the question, just let me know.
Thank you. I believe that Yukoners can have both. I think that Yukoners have the expertise and the commitment and the duty for future generations to ensure that there's both responsible mining and caribou coexisting together. I think both are necessary to succeed and help ensure our socioeconomic sustainability for all Yukoners. If the Yukon is to be empowered to address what is important to us all, and that includes and may be superseded by our collective concerns to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change and the importance of wildlife. So I think we must support responsible mineral exploration development right here at home and be a part of upholding companies to environmental and social governmental responsibility. If we're going to move to a green economy, minerals and elements are required to do so, many of which are found here in the territory. So I think working together with respect and collaboration and urgency to help support and demand responsible mining is what we should be doing. We have the Yukon Environmental Socioeconomic Assessment process, and it's meant to address finding this balance. So I support continued and actually increased support for Yukon First Nations to participate in the YESA process, including non-settled First Nations. I also think that the Yukon Water Board under Yukon government needs to work with YESA to ensure that there's minimal duplication in the process. I also think that mining companies in the Yukon, in my experience, believe in and uphold Indigenous rights and title, and that's another reason why we should support development here in the Yukon. And all sectors, not just mining, I think require certainty and the ESO process that doesn't change the goalposts, which is what's happened to this project. So that's why one of my priorities is to amend YESA in partnership with Yukon First Nations, Yukon government, to make sure that we have certainty for all Yukoners. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. All right, the next we have Lisa Volans-Leduc.
Thank you for the question. I'm with the caribou. Traditional ways need to be preserved and protected, and mining should not trump this. Mining needs to be sustainable. Destroying a unique herd of caribou whose movements are intrinsically connected to that of a people in order to extract more minerals is not sustainable. The NDP is not against mining. We believe that the mining industry has a place in the future of the Yukon, and that the role of government is to ensure that the benefits and costs of mining are shared appropriately. As the Yukon develops successor resource legislation, stakeholders such as the mining industry, workers, First Nations, governments, municipalities, and other relevant organizations will need to be heard. Past practices left a mess the public has to clean up. Think of Keno, Faro, Mount Nansen, and we're getting too little of the return. What's the NDP approach? We want to see good mining jobs go to Yukon people, with particular attention to First Nations workers in rural Yukon. Mining work can be an opportunity to stay on the land and in the community. We need affordable housing for Yukon workforce. Much of this is a territorial responsibility, I understand that. Our royalty regime in the Yukon is slim. Successor legislation will hopefully address Yukon getting a fair share of returns and where we mine. And the connected infrastructure, roads, power generation needs to be taken into account, whether there is a social license to mine there, achieved through land use planning and socioeconomic environmental assessment and other agreements. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. All right, next up we have Brendan.
Thank you, and thanks to Lenore for giving some of the context and background. And I think she might get an extra minute if she had more to say, because it's helped all of us. I'm going to be a politician and say there are three answers to this question. The first is the hypothetical actual question. If we had to choose between an enduring caribou herd and a temporary industrial project, then I would support the enduring survival of the caribou. But what we have is a very specific and very complicated situation where we have an actual, as Lenore said, deadlocked decision body. We should have a robust ESAP process that would allow us actually to have both responsible mining development. As I said yesterday, I believe in sustainable and responsible mining, and we should be able to have a process that allows us to protect our land and protect our wilderness. The solution to this particular issue is not for me to pronounce, because it is in the hands of the processes which are still ongoing. The federal government has intervened, has not made their decision as yet. And in order to provide and to give that more fulsome consultation with the CASCA. So ideally, we will be able to review YASAP and have a better process going forward. I think it is also important to point out the quartz mining and the water license as additional processes to help ultimately achieve a balanced result, I hope.
Great. Thank you all for your answer for the first question. We will move on to the next question, which is from CPAWS. The second question is from CPAWS Yukon. Since 1992, CPAWS Yukon has been working for Yukon's wild spaces. They are also an organizer of this evening's forum. So the order of the question, the answers to this question will be firstly, Dr. Hanley, then Lenore Morris, then Lisa Valens-Leduc, and then finally Jonas Smith. CPAW's question is, last week at the World Conservation Congress, governments and organizations from around the world came together to acknowledge growing scientific evidence that at least half of the planet's land and ocean needs protecting, conserving, and restoring. They set a global target of protecting and conserving at least 30% of land and ocean by 2030, in a way that prioritizes Indigenous rights, including free, prior, and informed consent. According to recent polling, this is a target supported by 78% of Yukoners. The question is, do you support these goals? And if so, how would you and your party help the Yukon and First Nations to achieve them?
Sorry, was this me first?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, okay. So I'll go ahead then. So the short answer is yes. The 2-minute answer is we know we have a crisis in loss of biodiversity and we need urgent action as part of an overall climate plan. And to me, conservation is not just a moral responsibility, but it's critical for preserving our ability to absorb and store carbon and prevent runaway global warming. At the same time, the Liberal Party of Canada has done great work in protecting record amounts of land and ocean, including 2 large investments in nature conservation, 1.3 billion in budget 2018 and 3.3 billion in budget 2021, allowing us to protect 1/4 of our lands and marine areas by 2025. So there is continued work to ensure Canada meets its goals for 25% in 25 and 30% by 2030. So that's working to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 in Canada, and hopefully achieving a full recovery by 2050. So there are also there's also work, of course, in preserving more land and ocean by creating national parks and marine conservation areas. So I hope that in Yukon, of course, this work should be in accordance with land claims agreements and the provisions under those, so that it'll make those protections possible. And I'll continue to push for faster flow of funding to complete land use planning as defined in the umbrella final agreement, so that we can really continue to have practical preservation and participate with Canada in achieving these goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan Hanley. Next up, we have Lenore Morris. Oh, sorry, Lenore, you have to unmute yourself.
I apologize. Sorry. Okay. Yes, absolutely. I support these goals. I think they're really important. And I think they're also really pressing goals. And what I mean by that is that we have the ability at this point to meet that target, but it gets harder and harder as land gets to developed and claims get made over that land to set that land aside. So this is something that both should be done, and it should be done really quickly. So in much of the Yukon, we already have a mechanism in place, and those are the land use planning councils that were established under the umbrella final agreement. So as you know, I mentioned it earlier, the Casket territory, we've got 3 unsettled First Nations, so there's land that is not covered by the land use planning. So we would start by examining what is protected under existing legislation, consult with First Nations and Yukon government to identify potential areas and potential models for conservation, support that land use planning process, which has been very, very slow so far. And I'm not saying that it should be rushed. Absolutely, it shouldn't be rushed, but we saw what happened with the Peel, where there was this sort of staking rush when land use planning was begun. That's a danger everywhere that people want to get their claims in. Lastly, I want to say we need to examine economic models that don't require constant growth. That is something that we need for long-term sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Lenore. Lisa, are you ready to go? Great.
You bet. Thanks. I absolutely support these goals. The NDP platform includes enshrining in law an environmental bill of rights, protecting 30% of the land, fresh water, and oceans by 2030. As traditional stewards of the land and water, Yukon First Nations are key to achieving such targets. The process is land use planning. This is enshrined in our agreements. I suspect that the completion of land use planning throughout Yukon will result in a lot of land and water being protected. The exact percentage of land set aside will be achieved because of its value for ecosystems, for people needing places to settle and build, because of its cultural value and beauty, and because First Nations, Canada, and Yukon reached an agreement. We recognize there are 3 First Nations whose traditional territories include land in the Yukon who do not currently have settlement agreements. The NDP has a strong track record, as it is a territory Yukon NDP government that negotiated the umbrella final agreement, which established land use planning. The umbrella final agreement was designed on the premise that land use conflicts would be resolved through regional land use planning. Unfortunately, this process has been dragged out. We believe that all deserve to know the lands that are available for mineral exploration and development, and the lands that are protected based on other values and interests. An NDP government would work with the territorial government and First Nations governments to make sure that resources are available to fulfill land use planning obligations. This is how we would get to 30%. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. All right, Jonas, are you ready to answer the question?
Yes, thank you. I think it's just important to point out that in 2003, the management of lands and resources in the Yukon were devolved from the federal government to the Yukon and First Nations governments. So that's just a jurisdictional note. That said, personally, I support a holistic territory-wide approach to conservation goals as opposed to the piecemeal approach we're taking right now. I think it's important to look at the big picture. So as Yukon's member of parliament, I would advocate for and work with Yukon First Nation governments, development corporations, citizens, and bilateral meetings and using a government to government approach to ensure the needs and priorities of Yukon First Nations are recognized. And I want to balance protection goals and mutually agreed upon targets with social and economic sustainability and continued opportunity for Yukoners. I would also prioritize Yukon First Nation participation in the case of the settled First Nations anyway, through the process outlined in the final agreements, which is the law of the Yukon. I personally don't believe that the vast majority of United Nations member states are any position to lecture Yukoners on how to treat Indigenous peoples. I think they could actually learn from us, as opposed to the other way around. But core to my value system as a Yukon member of parliament would be working with and for all Yukoners instead of a top-down approach from Ottawa and playing party politics or following some international agency's agenda, because I want what is best for the territory today and for our generations to follow. So I would work with Yukoners and set achievable goals, identify targets for protection, conservation, restoration, find realistic timelines, whether that's for caribou or Yukon River salmon, so that all Yukoners can share in and celebrate success in our collective desire to balance environmental protection and socioeconomic sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. All right, so we're moving along here. We're on to question 3. And this question comes from the Council of Yukon First Nations. The first to answer will be Jonas Smith. Second is Lisa Volans-Leduc, Lenore Morris, and then finally Dr. Hanley. So the Council of Yukon First Nations mandate is to serve as a political advocacy organization for Yukon First Nations holding traditional territories, to protect their rights, titles, and interests. Their question is, what is your party's plan to engage with Yukon First Nations to collaborate, coordinate, and mobilize efforts to adapt and mitigate the causes and impacts of climate change? Again, the first to answer is Jonas Smith.
Hey, thank you. I've said this many times before. I don't think Yukoners need Ottawa or Paris lecturing us on the realities of climate change. We just need to look out our windows, especially if you live in Marsh Lake or Lake Lebarge this summer. I think that anyone who's lived here long enough, it's very obvious to us that the world is changing dramatically, and we must find ways to adapt and innovate with a sense of urgency. I think that Yukon First Nations citizens bring a wealth of traditional knowledge that must be recognized and continually incorporated in adaptation and mitigation efforts, and whether that's regarding effects to wildlife or infrastructure. So as Yukon's member of parliament, I would collaborate with Yukon First Nations as partners, government to government. And I think that the single most effective action we can take together as Yukoners and to do our part for climate change is to develop small, scalable hydroelectric sites that have the potential for future added capacity. And so something like that would require Yukon First Nation investment, approval, and full partnership in order to succeed. I also think as an independent, I could advocate for Yukoners' needs and priorities in Ottawa and put Yukoners' interests above anything else. There are 338 seats in Parliament, 78 are in Quebec, 121 are in Ontario, but the Yukon only has 1. So that means that no matter who the Yukon elects, the decision is made before the polls even close in the West over who's going to form the next government. I think the Bloc Québécois is quite popular in Quebec right now, so it's likely that we're going to have another minority government. And in that instance, I could work with whichever party forms government to find solutions that work for all Yukoners, in particular, Yukon First Nation citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas. Next, we have Lisa from the NDP.
Yeah, thank you. Early in this campaign, I met with an elder, and he was telling me about how the moose migration is changing and that all animals are suffering right now. He had a question for me about whether or not I thought that we could change how Mother Earth is responding and taking care of herself. And I don't think we can, but what we can do is make changes to what we're doing now. The need to fight the climate crisis means no denial, means no delay, and our actions to reduce emissions, mitigate, and adapt utilizing traditional knowledge and science. the two are just as valid. We will work in partnership with Yukon First Nations to do this essential work to address the climate crisis. The Liberals announced action on the climate crisis, then bought a pipeline and didn't respect First Nation land guardians. The Conservatives, they won't even acknowledge that there is a climate crisis right now. They couldn't agree to it. New Democrats will expand upon Canada's new net zero law and set an ambitious target of reducing emissions by at least 50% from our 2005 levels by 2020. The NDP would make First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people full and equal partners in Canada's efforts to build a low carbon future, including encouraging energy sustainability in remote communities and opportunities for renewable energy projects. Climate investments are directed towards reducing inequality, honoring Indigenous rights, and supporting communities that have been left behind by decades of Liberal and Conservative inaction. A costing breakdown of our platform commitments was recently verified by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. We plan to spend $214 billion over the next 5 years, including $26 billion to fight climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, next up we have Lenore.
Okay, so I think I read this question a little differently. So my emphasis is definitely going to be on the engagement part of that. How do you engage? So First Nations people in the Yukon in the last several decades have had an awful lot of changes and an awful lot of stuff coming at them. So there's a legal obligation on the part of the government and anybody who's trying to do any development in their area to engage with them. A lot of the First Nations are very small. They have a small number of members. They have limited resources. So part of the engagement process is going to be offering them whatever they need. So that could be information, that can be resources, that can be analysis. In terms of like the means of engagement, my experience with First Nations people is that there's nothing like in person, talking to them face to face. It can also be, especially for younger people, it can be phone, email, letters, meetings, but face to face relationships is very important. Listening to First Nations people, offering encouragement, connecting with youth. I think that youth are, I mean, obviously they're the future, but they're really interested in things that are different. They're interested in solving the problems that we have. One of the great things is that it's obvious that they are great partners already, that they are showing some real leadership in terms of dealing with climate change in particular. A number of the First Nations have either brought online or are planning renewable energy projects. And it's an exchange of ideas. My view is you exchange your ideas, you make a plan, you carry out the plan, you adjusting as you need it.
Great, thank you, Lenore. All right, next we have Brendan Hanley.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, climate change, again, is the issue that convinced me to join the campaign as the LPC candidate. And we of course know, we know that the climate change effects are so much greater, 3 times greater in the north. But the experts in witnessing the effects on the ground of climate change are Yukon First Nation. So I see Yukon First Nation as essential partners in knowing the effects of climate change, the mitigations, and helping us lead the way to a green future together. Of course, engagement has been the approach of the federal Liberal government, and I have every intention of continuing that approach. The Liberal Party of Canada did establish Canada's first National Action Plan in 2016 with $100 billion investment. They have funded Indigenous leadership in nature conservation, including Indigenous protected and conserved areas, establishing the Indigenous Guardians programs, supporting Indigenous people's connections with traditional lands and waters and ice. And of course, on a Yukon context, we have benefited from federal investments to many of the First Nation-led projects. So the Old Crow Solar Project, the biomass projects with Carcross-Tagish First Nation, Tasman Tlingit Council, the Forest Resources Management Plan for Kluane First Nation to meet current and future local business needs. the grant to the government of Yukon to work collaboratively with First Nations to evaluate and address gaps in deployment of energy projects. So certainly a commitment to supporting First Nation priorities is in the platform. My commitment is there. My only question will be how can I further help, and where do you suggest we begin?
Great, thank you, Brendan. Those are all fantastic answers. I really appreciate all of your insight and thoughtfulness behind these answers. And I wish that we had more time to really pick your brain, more than 2 minutes, because I'm very interested in what you all have more to say. But next up, we have question number 4. And this is coming from the Yukon Youth Panel on Climate Change. And the order that we will be going in will be Dr. Hanley from Liberal Party, Lisa Volans, Leduc, NDP, Jonas Smith, Independent, Lenore Morris, Green. The question, it's working with BITE, Empowering Youth Society, and Yukon Government. The Yukon Youth Panel on Climate Change is a group of youth that is helping to provide direction for the Yukon's climate action over the next 10 years and beyond. Their question is, with the transportation sector responsible for the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the Yukon, there is currently a need to get carbon emitting vehicles off the road and drive up EV production. Considering that transportation emissions in the territory are in part caused by overconsumption, how would you ensure that the shift to greener transportation is responsible, sustainable, and considered that the less we buy, the less we emit? So again, first up is Dr. Hanley.
Thank you, and thanks. Thank you for the youth panel. My son tried to get on that panel and was not successful. I know there were some really great candidates, and thanks. So first of all, congratulations to all of you for participating, and whatever happens in this campaign, I certainly look forward to learning more from your insights. And in my mind, if we think there's a single solution to the climate crisis, that everyone goes out and changes over to brand new electric vehicles, then of course that's short-sighted. The climate solution needs to be holistic and multifaceted. So some of the platform elements, we all know that whatever has been done, we need to do a lot more, and we have to do a lot more quickly. But the Net Zero's Emissions Accountability Act, which was enacted, really means that targets are legislated to be accountable. And now the Liberal Party of Canada targets a 40 to 45% reduction in emissions, a price on pollution. Having that transition to 100% new vehicles, electronic vehicles, and at the same time, the Yukon context to that is that we need to get to 100% renewable energy. That should be the goal, as well as grants for home retrofits, funding Indigenous leadership, all of these. But I think the point is that we also need sustainable solutions. Better, cleaner transportation is already a federal Liberal commitment. Stewardship is another important aspect, and how does government facilitate responsible consumption? So looking for further ideas from you for sure, and forward to that partnership.
Thank you. And next up we have Lisa.
Thank you, and thank you to the Youth Panel on Climate Change for this question. We need to change how we get around. We will help Canadians have access to greener transportation options. New Democrats will invest and expand public transit, support regional commuting options by developing a public intercity bus system and rail services. Now that's the national plan, and it would of course look different here, but we are including bus systems between Whitehorse and rural communities. We'll scale up low carbon transit projects like zero emission vehicles and aim to electrify transit and other municipal fleets by 2030. We'll also expand active transportation to help Canadians who want to walk or bike in their communities. More zero emission vehicles will be easier to get, and we're hoping we're not hoping, our plan is to have more of these options built in Canada. We'll have incentives of up to $15,000 to buy made in Canada vehicles. Our emissions are coming from home heating. We have to heat our houses up to 7 months of the year, and transporting goods up the highway is necessary. And how do we address this? We invest in retrofitting homes. We invest in renewable sources of energy like wind, solar, and hydro. And we do this in partnership with First Nations as a path towards economic reconciliation. There is progress on this. Bantagwitchin First Nations Solar Park, interest in wind from Carcross-Tagish, Kluwani, and Kwalindun First Nations, hydro development in Taku River Tlingit country. Transportation of goods in the Yukon, we use lots of diesel fuel, home heating, LNG for electrification coming up the highway. Retrofitting can reduce this. I went to the Yukon Conservation Society and I saw the project that they have on the go with the electric thermal storage, which is really interesting because that uses less electric by heating up the bricks and emitting that heat. We also have renewable energy like wind instead of LNG.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Next up, we have Jonas.
Thank you. I think that in order to shift to greener transportation, we must finally address and act upon expanded green energy solutions. I mean, Yukoners can't expand green transportation without green energy. We were talking about this the other night at one of the other forums that electric vehicles can't responsibly be powered by rented diesel generators. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that greener transportation options must be pursued with the recognition of the differences of realities between Whitehorse and the rural communities, because there are some pretty big differences there. But as the Yukon's Member of Parliament, I would ensure that the needs and priorities of all Yukon communities are considered and acted upon instead of some one-size-fits-all Ottawa approach. I think that the Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce, their recently study that they undertook on Yukoners' transportation needs would be a good starting point to help understand the territory's realities and how most effectively these goals can be achieved. I'd also like to work with Yukoners as your federal representative and your conduit to Ottawa with all orders of government and applicable NGOs and Yukoners themselves to ultimately find solutions that work for all Yukon communities. And again, I think the single most meaningful thing that Yukoners can do together to address climate change is to develop additional clean energy solutions in partnership with First Nations, in particular, new hydro. So that's my main priority again. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonas. And lastly, we have Lenore.
I'm unmuting. Okay. So I have an electric vehicle. I have a plug-in hybrid, and absolutely, here in Whitehorse, 10 months of the year, we are burning fossil fuels to produce electricity. I will say this, that Yukon Energy actually produces their energy more efficiently than internal combustion engine vehicles do. So there is actually still some savings that I'm operating in the winter, but it's not ideal. I echo what everybody else says. Obviously, we have to have more renewable energy. But I also want to get into one of the things that was mentioned in the question about overconsumption, that there's this idea that we have to just replace all the stuff where we're burning gas with stuff where we're using electricity. And I don't see it that way. There's lots of ways that we could reduce the amount of greenhouse gases and the amount of energy associated with transportation now, because the Yukon's in an unusual situation. Like, we're using, the transportation sector is much bigger here than it is in terms of greenhouse gases than it is most places. So smaller cars, fewer trucks, more carpooling. We should have Uber. We should have the ability to car share. And that's stuff that's done in some places. And lots of people would do it if it could be done conveniently here. We need our speed limits to be enforced. That's actually a really important thing. We need to think about why we want transportation and why we want cars. So we want cars for transportation, but that's not the only method of transportation. Often we want transportation because we want interaction. We can do that other ways. Zoom has taught us that you don't actually have to travel to meetings all the time. There's lots of things where we just need to think outside the box. And absolutely, I believe that we need to move to a society where there's less emphasis on constant growth and more on sustainability.
Great, thank you, Lenore. I love how you provided some really concrete examples there, like Uber would be fantastic. Of course, for sure. All right, okay, so the next question is question number 5. And the order for the answers will be firstly, Lisa Valance-Leduc from NDP, Dr. Hanley, Liberal Party, Jonas Smith, Independent, and then Lenore Morris from the Green Party. The next question comes from the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. WCS is an organization that uses a unique blend of on-the-ground scientific research and policy action to help protect wildlife. Their question is, what regional or international results or outcomes of a warming climate are likely to affect the Yukon in the next 5 years, and how should we prepare for them? And again, Lisa is first to answer.
Thank you. Thank you to the Wildlife Conservation Society for the question. We are at the forefront of the crisis in Canada, alongside Yukon First Nations, have the opportunity to be leaders in the global effort to tackle the climate crisis. Melting permafrost, changing weather conditions like more rain and snow, extreme temperature fluctuations, and erosion left by rising levels in our rivers will adversely impact food security. We'll see more emergencies related to wildfires and flooding. Social problems will get worse, like homelessness, mental health and wellness, loss of traditional culture, risks to species, salmon, caribou, and moose populations, invasive species with the species migration of cougars and deer, impacts on infrastructure, roads and buildings amid the melting permafrost. Climate change will make everything harder, and we know time is running out. Pipelines and further investments into fossil fuels, like the Liberals and Conservatives continue to push, is both costly and ineffective. For our mitigating efforts, the NDP will stop subsidizing fossil fuels and invest in First Nations renewable energy projects. We'll reduce emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. We'll make a just transition by training workers in green technology and create 1 million new jobs across the country. The NDP will make sure moving forward, the climate is considered in everything we do. For adaptation efforts, we will make sure those impacted by climate emergencies are cared for. We'll make sure the infrastructure is adapted for climate realities like roads and buildings. New Democrats have a 5-year plan to spend $26 billion to fight climate change and support workers who may need to transition out of high polluting industries such as oil and gas, and $35 billion redirected to a climate bank to boost investment in renewable energies. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, next is Dr. Hanley from the Liberal Party.
Thank you. Yeah, so to reiterate a few of the effects that Lisa noted, but I think they're well known what the climate change hazards are, but worth repeating: wildfires and flooding, of course, thawing permafrost, damage to infrastructure, houses, buildings, roads, and changing habitat, which affects migration patterns, the ability to harvest from the land, as well as aggravating all of the other impacts. So, and changing habitat can involve new species introductions and the loss of biodiversity, which we have already said is at a critical point. So these are anticipated to affect Yukoners in many ways, such as the increased resources we'll need for emergencies and healthcare, damage to public infrastructure. This is something that the Liberal government has been working on and preparing for. I know the government of Yukon was provided with funding from Canada to begin work on a Yukon risk assessment project. And the Government of Canada's Climate Change and Clean Growth Plan, released in December, based on 5 pillars, including low carbon transportation, green electricity, a few other things we've touched upon before. I like, in terms of the adaptation, which this is really about adaptation and preparation, the Yukon's Clean Future Plan lays out several strategies worth noting, including, ensuring that we have resilient infrastructure and that we're prepared for emergencies. The most recent federal government provides $25 million this year to Government of Yukon to support its climate change priorities. And many of those priorities have to be in adaptation and emergency preparation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hanley. Next, we have Jonas Smith.
Okay, thank you. As others have mentioned, I think changes to permafrost and ice cover affect our roads, our travel routes, and our airstrips, which are all things that we rely upon as a remote northern jurisdiction, and that we must work together to decrease our emissions. Other impacts that others have talked about, increased annual precipitation, rain and snowfall. We saw that this year. Temperature increases, which lead to increased fire risk, and all these things negatively impact our wildlife, our residents, and our communities. So I think that both innovative technologies and Indigenous traditional knowledge can help inform Yukoners and our communities in how we adapt. But I also support a responsible mining industry to produce these key elements for these new green technologies. Copper and gold and others are required for solar and wind energy. I also support upgrades and retrofits for existing buildings. I'd like to see expanded investments in local community food production and things that would support a longer growing season and allow for more local food production and supply, and reduce our reliance on food coming up the highway, which also contributes to emissions. I support incentives for new green construction, whether that's building codes or financial incentives. Another potential opportunity, in addition to my hopes for First Nation co-developed new hydro, this would be over a longer planning horizon, but that would be a power grid intertie with either BC or Alaska, because that would have massive regional benefits, and we not only do a part for the Yukon, but for the whole region. I'm a big advocate for timber harvesting agreements to allow businesses to have biomass fuels or household timber fuels supplied here at home instead of being trucked up the highway from BC and Alberta, which is being considered right now, which again contribute to our greenhouse gas emissions. But again, just to repeat myself while I have time, is I think the best thing we can do is develop new hydro. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. Last but not least, we have Lenore.
There we go. The number of effects that we are going to see in the Yukon are many, and some of them are going to have just enormous impact. So we're already seeing some of them. Wildfires is one of the big one, and we are already starting to do some of the stuff that we need to do. The Yukon, for the most part, doesn't fight its wildfires at this point, because it's just, the territory is huge and the population's small. We only fight them if they're close to communities. We are starting to do a lot of fire smarting. That's a hugely expensive process. It generates jobs. It needs to be done. Hopefully we can more and more combine it with the use of that firewood and with biomass. Other changes, flooding, we saw this year, that's a huge one. The permafrost melting is potentially going to be one of the most expensive problems that we have here in the Yukon. We've been seeing it for a long time in terms of the damage that it's doing to our roads. When I was doing a little bit of research on this, it was sort of brought to my attention that the Yukon's not the only northern community. So we are one of 3 territories in the north, all very sparsely populated. We've got the Alaska with actually a much higher population, twice as many as in the whole entire Canadian north. But we also have, like, there's Russia, there's Scandinavia. A lot of countries are dealing with some of these issues already. I was reading about a road in between Tibet and China, like techniques are being developed, and we could do a lot in terms of learning and collaborating with other nations that are dealing with some of these issues. One of the other big things that I see happening is invasive species. We're already seeing that now with things like deer and cougar that are moving up from down south, but also we had a massive, unprecedented spruce bark beetle infestation that started in the 90s that resulted in the loss of almost 400,000 hectares of spruce.
Thank you, Lenore. All right. We are now moving on to question number 6. And the order will be Lenore Morris, Green Party, Lisa Valance-Leduc, NDP, Jonas Smith, Independent, Dr. Hanley, Liberal Party. Our final question for this section of the forum is from the Yukon First Nations Climate Action Fellowship. This group of young people was formed after Yukon First Nations leadership declared that a Yukon First Nations climate vision and action plan should be youth-led, as it is their future at stake that they will inherit the decisions made now. Fellows are journeying together through online, in-person, and on-the-land programming. In doing so, they are building upon emotional, spiritual, physical, and intellectual skills to approach climate solutions as whole people. Their question is, how will your party support the climate declaration movement involving the empowerment of young people moving forward in a good way in a time of urgent climate crisis? And again, first to speak is Lenore Morris.
The youth, both in the world, the Yukon and worldwide, are showing huge leadership already. So everybody knows who Greta Thunberg is. She's inspired young people around the world. And so I want to work with that enthusiasm that's already there. There was somebody here that came, this fellow named Steve Lee. He inspired me, but he actually came to the Yukon 2 years ago, and he spoke at almost every high school in the Yukon, and he was fantastic. So he's young, he's very tech savvy, and his entire presentation's about climate change. Like, there's all kinds of ways to inspire people. I was totally impressed with him. In 2019 as well, it was a group of girls here in Whitehorse who organized the Fridays for Future demonstrations, which ended up being the biggest public demonstrations that we'd ever had in the Yukon. So I'm totally interested in working with youth, because it seems to me that they're on the same page as me in that I treat the climate emergency as an actual emergency, not as sort of white noise is the term that I heard recently referring to climate change talk, that it's always going on and nobody pays attention anymore. We need to give young people a roadmap. We need to give them practical tasks, make them see things that they can do. Climate change is so massive that it's daunting and it's overwhelming. It needs to be broken down into discrete tasks, things that people can actually work on and see that they're making progress. And it does matter what we do here in the Yukon. It does matter what we do in Canada. Even though we're small, we are the number 10 greenhouse gas emitter on the planet, which means there's 190 countries less than us. It does matter what we do. The Green Party would lower the voting age to 16. We would affect democratic reform, make every vote count. We want engagement.
Great, thank you, Lenore. Okay, next we have Lisa.
Thank you. Youth are certainly demanding attention be paid to the climate crisis. It's why I've started paying attention. Youth like Autumn Pelletier, a young Indigenous water activist calling attention to the need for clean water in all Indigenous communities, and Greta Thunberg. Canadian cities are declaring climate emergencies. Yukon has even signed, and Whitehorse has signed. Territorially, the NDP motion is what got the territory to admit that there is a climate emergency. These declarations are a way to raise awareness and keep a climate lens on decisions. Just yesterday, city councillors in London, Ontario said no to widening a 4-lane road up to 6 lanes. There's too much already, so they didn't want to increase it to contribute to that congestion. There's no longer any doubt about the climate crisis. We can't tolerate denials or delays. We are also, the NDP, hoping and planning to lower the voting age to 16. This will ensure youth voice and vote are taken into consideration by all parties in their platforms. I'll meet with groups, talk to youth, listen to what their concerns are, and incorporate their voice when I'm in Ottawa, if I'm so lucky to be that person elected. We need to move away from just declarations and move into action. September 20th is a huge day. A vote for me and the NDP is a vote for the environment. It's a vote for people, for reconciliation, and for housing. The choice is clear. Vote September 20th. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And next we have Jonas Smith.
Hey, thank you. You know, I have to admit that I've never been a fan of using the word crisis. Just, I'm worried that it promotes fear, and I don't think that's the right approach. I mean, I've been hearing that the world was on the verge of destruction since I was a youth, 30 whatever years ago, and I think there's got to be a better way to encourage urgency and action, because action is definitely required. So I just prefer terms like climate action. And anyway, that's an aside. I think youth are certainly our most valued resource in our decisions today and for the generations to follow. And as such, youth must be at the table in the decisions we make on their behalf. And so that they're able to have the same opportunities that, you know, my generation, previous generations have benefited from. So as a Yukon's Member of Parliament, I would work with Yukon First Nations Climate Action Fellowship and all orders of government and applicable NGOs. I think that the Yukon is very fortunate to not only be leading the country, but frankly, the entire world with our modern day comprehensive Yukon First Nations final and self-government agreements. A great number of principles found in the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are addressed in our final agreements and self-governing agreements, which in my mind is a further testament to the drafter's vision. But that said, there is still much work left to do. So I'm committed to working with Yukon First Nations on this in conjunction with all levels of government to identify priorities that we can work on together and implement our agreements. And again, I think the best way to do our part, and specifically for the benefit of our youth and future generations, is to develop clean energy solutions in partnership with First Nations and Yukon government. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jonas. And lastly, Brendan Henley.
Thank you. I'm, you know, one of the reasons that I felt the urgency of climate change action was because I have two children now teenagers. One of whom was one of those girls, activist girls, protesting that Lenore referred to, although being fairly quiet spoken, she was a little more in the background. But I do, and just to take a slightly different point of view from Jonas, I think this is a crisis. I think the challenge is how we go forward to manage multiple crises, because we still have a pandemic, we have an opioid emergency, mental health and addictions in general, and climate change, and they are actually all at crisis level. So how do we manage and maintain our optimism, our pragmatism, and go forward with positivity? And that is a challenge. And I think our youth have a lot of those answers and have shown great leadership here. So I would be very happy to continue to support our young people. Some of the declaration are enhancing meaningful participation, urgently scaling up investment in responsive adaptation, child-specific or youth-specific. So really continuing to be partners and to recognize the leadership. The Liberal Party of Canada has made substantial investments in youth supports, either through the pandemic or in creating Canada's youth policy, for example. So I think the federal Liberal government is a partner, and I would be happy to be a partner and an advocate.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much. All right, so now we have come to part 4, questions from the public. And we will get to as many questions that we can, but it's likely going to be 2 questions. And to ensure we have a representative and varied selection of questions, CPAWS and YCS staff have chosen a group of questions from your submissions. Each party representative will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. And all right. So a person named Clive has asked, we have made great strides in going paperless in the last 2 decades. We need to do the same with plastic packaging. We need to find alternatives to plastic because even when plastics break down to micro size, they are even more devastating to microfauna. Will your party develop a policy on this environmental problem facing society? And the first to answer will be Lisa, second, Lenore, third, Dr. Hanley, and fourth, Jonah Smith. So Lisa.
Thank you. That is an excellent question. And a policy around reducing plastics is part of our platform. And they got to go. It's the microplastics was something that I heard a lot of when we were filling up our sandbags out at Marsh Lake, because they were using some of those white plastic bags. So that's a concern that we have, and we want to make sure that we'll be able to clean those up. And yeah, I really thank Clive for this question. I do what I can right now to reduce my use of plastics. I recycle where I can. We can make more compostable containers, and they also have those, I don't know what they're called, but they're different than using saran wrap. I've gifted those and purchased those so that I can use those in my home. We do have a plan to get rid of plastic single-use bags. And when I do use one of those plastic bags from the grocery store, it's not single-use. I'm using them for other things around the yard. And yeah, they definitely have to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Up next, we have Lenore.
Thank you, Clive. This is a hugely important issue. It's almost a pet peeve of mine that every time I go into the store that I'm faced with aisle after aisle after aisle of things that are wrapped in plastic. And it comes that way because for the manufacturers, plastic has become incredibly cheap and it protects the goods. So it's useful and it's really cheap. And because they don't have to deal with the garbage. So like we're buying all this stuff that's manufactured in Ontario, in the United States, in China, and it's coming to the Yukon and we have to deal with the garbage here. And so there's been a move for a long time, which I totally support, the Green Party completely supports, which is to make manufacturers responsible for dealing with the entire stream of their products so that it's packaging, but it's also making sure that things are made, like the goods themselves can be manufactured. It's ridiculous that I'm feeling guilty at the store, at the grocery store, because I can't buy things that aren't wrapped in plastic. This is something where collective action is needed. I and millions of other people shouldn't be making these decisions. The government can simply tell manufacturers that you cannot keep using these kinds of packaging. There's all kinds of alternatives that have been developed, including alternatives to plastic itself, and we can use them. A few years ago, I use printers at work. Printers come in these, it's in a giant case, comes in styrofoam, and then it comes in a big plastic bag, and then it comes in a box. Totally unnecessary. I did write to Brother asking them to stop, but they still come that way. What has to happen is that the government has to step in and show some leadership.
Great, thank you, Lenore. Okay, so next up we have Brendan Hanley.
Yeah, thanks, Clive, for the question. And I think we need to first do a lot better with paper. I don't think we're quite paperless yet. And so that's one point. I think in plastic waste, really just to build on what everyone has said so far, there is a commitment from the Liberal Party of Canada to achieve zero plastic waste by 2030. We know that recycling of plastic is a pretty hopeless solution right now. Only 9% plastic is recycling. So fundamentally, we need to reduce consumption. There are a number of elements in the plan accelerating the plan to put again the burden, more of the burden and responsibility on producers. So supporting a federal public registry, for example, so that we're putting accountability to the producer. I think that's an important point. Working to implement a much more ambitious recycling target for those beverage bottles that are recyclable, providing reusable and recyclable products. So a number of elements. Again, I think I'm thinking of the question earlier about from the youth on consumption, and how do we look at this more holistically and not. We are dreadful consumers of plastic products. It's so, as Lenore said, so cheap and easy, and we have to find ways to be leaders in educating all of ourselves to reduce our consumption at the same time.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Jonas.
Yes, thank you. I'll echo others. This is a great question. You know, I've never been a big fan of carbon taxes in the northern context. It just doesn't make sense to me that you would financially punish northerners who don't have options other than to heat their homes to literally survive or transport essential goods up here. And I've always thought that something more meaningful and immediate that we could do as northerners and Canadians is to reduce packaging. I think for any parent on Christmas morning, you look at the carnage under the Christmas tree. Toys nowadays come with multiple layers of plastic and twist ties, and it just, you feel awful putting that all in the recycling at the end of the day, knowing that a good portion of it is not actually going to be recycled. So absolutely support reducing packaging. I think that's very meaningful. We could do that very quickly. But that said, on top of reducing it, the other part is recycling. And so I think one of the things that we could do nationally is harmonize recycling regulations between provinces and territories. That's one of the big reasons that it's not economic in some areas to recycle certain plastics. So I think that's a big thing that we could do. Something else that we could do with plastics is P&M Recycling here in Whitehorse used to have a reactor that was designed by Yukon College that took waste plastic and converted it to heating fuel, and they used to heat their warehouse with that. So I think that's another great solution for the north. And that way we don't have to transport those plastics back down the highway. We can use them here. But ultimately, I think one of the most meaningful things we can do immediately too is encourage more local production, particularly when it comes to food. That way we don't have to use all that plastic packaging that others were referring to when we buy things at the grocery store, and support a local economy at the same time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jonas. Okay, the next question comes from Eric, and his question is, what will you do to accelerate the Yukon's pursuit of an energy independent, clean energy powered future? The order of answers will be, firstly, Dr. Hanley, Liberal Party; second, Lisa Volans-Leduc, NDP; Lenore Morris, Green; and finally, Jonas Smith, Independent. So, Brendan Hanley.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, this is again, and I mentioned earlier when we were talking about electric vehicles, and I think many of us referenced that we need to move and be a leader, and we have so many opportunities to be leaders in renewable energy and green energy. And I mentioned a few of those, the projects, such as the solar project in Oak Crow, some of the wind exploration projects, and biomass. There is immense interest, at least, and initial development of the potential for geothermal energy. There's the projects already underway or under consideration, such as the Atlan extension, the Atlan hydro extension, and much opportunity for further hydro development. So I think integral to a green energy plan is investment in renewable energy and moving away, as there is a federal liberal commitment to have prices on pollution and to move to emissions free by 2050, to be emission neutral by 2050. Coming along with that are the substantial investments in green energy infrastructure and the human resources required and the support for projects. Again, First Nations are here, have proven to be leaders in this, and I'm very excited about partnering and promoting further opportunities in green energy.
Thank you, Brendan. Next, Lisa.
Thank you. It's a great question, Eric. I put reconciliation at the core of this effort, upholding Indigenous knowledge and respecting inherent sovereignty. The NDP recognized that as original peoples of this country, Indigenous people have intimate connections to their homelands, territories, and resources, and have provided stewardship since forever. Indigenous people are best placed to protect cultural and biological diversity through control over their territory. Recognition of inherent rights, title, and treaty will also be at the heart of our approach in addressing climate change. We must move past delays and inaction and move forward, one that recognizes an holistic definition of sustainability. We will invest in Indigenous-led science and support the creation of Indigenous managed protected areas. We'll invest in green energy, creating new jobs and opportunities. We'll make sure that species recovery efforts respect Indigenous rights and embrace traditional knowledge to increase biodiversity. I will work jointly with Indigenous leadership and communities to develop coordinated action plans and respond to climate change emergencies like wildfire and floods. We will move from subsidizing oil and gas to subsidizing the green economy with renewable projects. There's lots of potential here in the territory, like the Buntagwitchin First Nation Solar Park, wind, interest already through Kwanlin First Nation, Carcross Tagish, Buntagwitchin, Kluane First Nation, Selkirk First Nation, and the Taku River Tlingit. And we are moving towards an environmental Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Lenore?
There are many potential sources of renewable energy in the Yukon, and we just need to tap into it. In terms of what the Member of Parliament does, mainly it is bringing money to the Yukon for these kinds of projects, but the federal government sends a lot of money to the Yukon. A lot of it can be directed, and I suggest that a lot more of it should be directed to renewable energy. We're already in a sort of shortfall position in that we're using more energy than we're producing with renewables. So it's obvious to everybody that we need more renewables on board. A lot of that can be built in the communities specifically, and solar and wind are probably the two biggest potential, and they should both of them be operating with batteries so that we can, both of them have the problem that they're, well, obviously we only have solar energy when the sun's shining, we only have wind energy when the wind's blowing, so they can be working with batteries. Geothermal, though, that is 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We have potential for geothermal. We know that because we have hot springs right here in the Yukon. Biomass has been mentioned. That'll go well with the fire smarting. Heat pumps are something that could be required to go into new construction. That's a huge reducer of the electricity needed to, or power needed to heat our buildings. Absolutely. Expanding the electrical grid so that we can even things out with the different projects that are not potentially going to be using producing power all the time. One of the other ways that we even that out is with the grid. Small hydro is another thing that could be where there's probably a lot of potential as well. There's been enormous improvements in technology over recent years, and a lot of things that weren't feasible before are feasible now. We need to take advantage of that.
Great, thank you, Lenore. Jonas?
Yes, thank you. I really like how you've worded the question, energy independence. You know, I've long said that the self-determination in the North will never truly be realized without self-reliance. And so I like that idea of independence. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but I think hydro development is the way to do that. I mean, biomass, geothermal, solar, wind, anything that offsets any kilowatt hour of diesel generation is good. But the reality is the way our population is growing and how electric heat is being prioritized in new construction, I think the only renewable source that has the technology existing today that will meet these needs is hydro. And I think we have a unique opportunity here in the Yukon because we have 11 settled First Nations who collectively have hundreds of millions of dollars as part of their settlements that's currently invested in other areas. But here's an opportunity for them to invest in Yukon's future and have a considerable repayment on that investment. And what's also neat is that Yukon Energy mapped hydro capacity potential decades ago, and a number of the sites that are particularly interesting are actually in the traditional territories of the non-settled First Nations. So it's an opportunity for them to benefit as well through partnership. So I think by ensuring First Nation involvement and partnership, they can help design the project to help mitigate environmental impacts. And maybe we need a private sector partner and expertise in there. But at the end of the day, as Lenore mentioned, the MP's job is to take this partnership and this idea to Ottawa and sell it and get the money, the federal investment here. We don't have the tax base or the ratepayer base to pay for it ourselves, but this would truly be nation building and benefit generations of Yukoners. So thank you again for the question. It was great.
Thank you all for your responses. It looks like we still have more time for more questions. The next question is coming from Barbara, and she asks, what is your understanding of the spirit and intent of the final agreements of the Yukon self-governing First Nations? And the first to answer will be Jonas Smith from the Independent, second, Lenore Morris, Green, third, Dr. Hanley, Liberal Party, and finally, Lisa Valens-Leduc from NDP. Jonas?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Barb. I think that the spirit and intent has been often, it's taken a back seat to legal interpretations over this last decade or so. In my mind, the whole notion of spirit and intent was to implement the agreements in a manner that benefited all Yukoners in partnership, working together. And it's unfortunate that things have gotten to the point sometimes where we have to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get clarity. And sometimes when you end up before a judge, you get an interpretation that might not necessarily be what any of the parties back here in the Yukon or that were in those parties' best interest, rather. I've had the honor and privilege over the course of my career of working with people who were at the table negotiating the UFA for all three orders of government. And I think that we could really benefit by consulting with them, the original drafters about their intentions before we ended up in court. So back to your question, to me, spirit and intent is working together for the benefit of all Yukoners, all three signatories for the benefit of future generations. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Jonas. Next, we have Lenore.
Okay, I'm a lawyer, so I do think of them as legal documents. They are incredibly important documents. So the Umbrella Final Agreement was a template document. One of the things that led to it, and that was a big influence, was a document first produced by, I think it was the then called the Yukon Native Brotherhood, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. That still encapsulates much of the spirit, was that they wanted to secure the future generations of First Nations people. So the Umbrella Final Agreement became a template agreement for each of the land claims and self-government agreements with each of the 11 First Nations that have settled. And there's 3 more that haven't settled. I spoke to one of them, Chief Charlie, last week. He said that they were interested in a self-government agreement. They're not interested in negotiating a land claims agreement because they want to have influence over their entire traditional territory. Those agreements are revolutionary. They are really unusual in Canada. Canada, in a lot of ways, is a generation ahead of most of Canada in terms of having these really good modern treaties. And so, yes, it's a really, really important part of the government. So that's it's between each individual First Nation and the Yukon government and the government of Canada. Canada's obligation is to honor both the spirit and the letter of the law of each of those modern treaties. And I absolutely would advocate for that in my role as MP.
Thank you, Lenore. Brendan Hanley, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready, and I'm not a lawyer. So, but I think so. I'll talk kind of more largely on this, but and also I think it's also building on Jonas and Lenore. I think one part of this comes back to reconciliation. And reconciliation is one of the themes close to my heart that I brought in as we have so many opportunities to further the work of reconciliation. And when I went around and spoke to people and to leaders and to chiefs and councils, reconciliation means honoring agreements and honoring implementation. So this is important. And a couple of comments just to reiterate from Lenore that Yukon is advanced because of these agreements. And Yukon, just as we can show leadership in so many areas, including the march towards green and green energy, is the implementation of these agreements. Still much to do, but when we look at the work that has been done in procurement policy, in the Intergovernmental Forum, in the land use planning that has come so far and which does need to continue, I think we do have strengths there. We need to go back to that original concept. We are here together for the children of tomorrow. Nowhere does that speak more than to the issue of climate change and the need for a continued partnership and action on climate change.
Thank you, Brendan. Next, we have Lisa.
Thank you, Barbara, for the question. As I said earlier, the NDP was part of the negotiating the Umbrella Final Agreements. The intent was one of collaboration and working together for future generations. And this includes that for fish and wildlife management, land use planning, self-determination, again, co-management and collaboration. We need to listen to those who were sitting at the table when the agreements were signed, and the intent is being lost from what I'm hearing in my travels around the territory. This is signed between First Nations Canada and the territory. There was one elder that I spoke to who said Yukon was at the table out of respect because we do all live here together. And the land use planning is taking far too long. So we really need to listen, and we need to try and drive back what the original intent was to those agreements. And not all parties have respected this. I mean, we can just look to our recent past in the Peel watershed and how long that took and how much money that costs for everybody in the territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, so next up, we have a question from Sandy. And the order of answering will be Lenore Morris, Green Party, Jonas Smith, Independent, Lisa Valens-Leduc, NDP, and Dr. Hanley, Liberal Party. Sandy asks, in order to address climate change, the world has endorsed the necessity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and Canada has signed on to establishing specific reduction targets. Here in the Yukon, how would you ensure that the concerted efforts of Yukoners to reduce GHG emissions through expenditures or on retrofits, electric vehicles, turning down the thermostat, reduced air travel, etc., are not obliterated by emissions by mines, oil and gas development and/or other industrial development? So again, Lenore, you're up first.
I think that's a great thing to ask about. It's been a sort of, it's something I think about a lot because Canada has made a number of specific international commitments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's pretty well known that we've yet to meet a single target. We've been making them since the 1990s. And within Canada, there's just a huge variation. There are all kinds of people that are really serious and are making small, medium, big efforts to reduce their individual carbon footprint. And I would say it's within Canada, we've got a huge problem, which is that most of the provinces are actually doing fairly well. The average, it's tons of greenhouse gases per capita in Canada is about 20, which is quite high. It's 12 is the average for OECD countries. That's a group of basically rich countries, but within Canada, there's huge variations. The best of the two provinces are Ontario and Quebec with 10 and 11. They're actually both below the OECD number. The Yukon, if you were wondering, the number is 17 here. So it's still below the average for Canada. The average for Canada is so high because of two provinces. It's Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I would say that not just within the Yukon, but within Canada, we really need to be looking at where the problem is and addressing it. And that's been a huge problem for both of the two big parties, which is that they've not been willing to take on oil and gas and recognize that that's where the problem is. And that's where we need to reduce our emissions, because absolutely everybody else is doing these things and our efforts are being completely canceled out by the oil and gas industry.
Thank you, Lenore Morris. Next, we will have an answer from Jonas Smith.
Yes, thank you. Interesting question. I think one thing to keep in mind to put things in context is one of the arguments I hear about Canadians doing their part for climate change is people say, well, you know, China's building a new coal-fired generation plant once a month, and so it doesn't matter what Canadians do. But the counter argument, of course, is every little bit that we can do does help. So I think it's important to apply that rationale to the Yukon context as well. I mean, we're a new mine to come online tomorrow. Yes, potentially it could, offset whatever progress we have made with, smart meters and green or electric vehicles and whatnot. But I think we're still making progress, and we also need to keep in mind the benefits that that kind of a development has for the Yukon. I mean, throughout the pandemic, if it weren't for Victoria Gold's construction, I think thousands and thousands of Yukoners wouldn't have had jobs. The food bank wouldn't have had $100,000. So in my mind, we can have both. But specifically to your question, what can we do? I come back to developing additional clean energy options. I think that if we produce enough power that mines can plug in and not have to generate power on site. That would have an enormous impact, as well as if we were to intertie with BC or Alaska. So I hope that answers your question, and it was a good one. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jonas. Next, we have Lisa Valance-Leduc from NDP.
Thank you, Sandy, for the question. So part of this ensuring greenhouse gas emissions are met and not lost through the mining emissions that are happening in the territory would be retrofitting, shift how mining industry powers their operations by investing in green industry. So end subsidizing oil and gas and allow them to shift how they power their mines. We'll have to hold mining industries. We will hold mining industries to account for polluting. They could pay for it, have a plan for cleanup. And we can't just go to zero emissions and move those emissions to another country. We have to recognize what we're using here, what we're emitting, and account for it. And that if they were just moved, it would just be contributing to global emissions. I read a really interesting book by Sheila Watt-Cloutier called The Right to Be Cold. And it was an incredibly important book for me to read because I'd never considered wanting to be cold. I grew up in Southern Ontario, and when I moved here, I realized the importance of the winter season. I have to just reiterate, holding the mining industry to account and subsidizing oil and gas industries and allowing for alternative energy sources and investing with Yukon First Nations that are interested in moving towards that green economy. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, and we have Brendan Hanley last.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I agree. It's a great question. It's an important question. We know that the relative contribution of mining to greenhouse gas emissions in Yukon will vary with of course, the amount of mining that's in the territory. Currently, I think it's only around 10%, but if there were several major projects or one or two, that could substantially increase. So that accountability is important, as is again, the investment in renewable energy that the minings need to take to be partners and investors and participants in funding as well, so that adding on mining means that we increase our government. In our clean future, there was an allocation of 25 million. And with that, there's a plan for setting carbon intensity targets for mining in Yukon. There's also in the Yukon green energy plan, our clean. Did I just lose everyone, or?
Yeah, I could not hear the last bit of what you said there.
Oh, okay. So I was talking about our clean future, and that in our clean future, there are progress indicators. I think we need to have accountability at all levels of government for how we achieve those targets, so that as we reduce the transportation footprint, we also keep an even keel on mining. We need mining. Again, responsible, sustainable mining is part of our future, and it's also assisting with production of critical minerals for, again, investing in batteries and other renewable energy sources. So we need to be accountable and keep in balance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for sending in your questions. That'll be it for the public questions section. We'll be moving on now to the closing remarks of each candidate. And we will go Brendan Hanley firstly. Next will be Jonas Smith, and then Lisa Volans-Leduc, and then Lenore Morris. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Hanley.
Thank you. So this has definitely been an interesting, very interesting discussion and interesting exchange of views. So thank you very much to CPAWS for hosting the event. I hope that this helps give a better sense of my views and the Liberal Party Canada's views on some of these critical issues. Again, I think I can bring an experienced voice from my public health experience and medical experience and my years here to be in a good position to be an advocate for the northern considerations, including the high impacts of climate change that we experience in the north. I will note that Mark Jacquard, a leading energy economist, rated the climate plans from the four parties, gave top marks to the Liberal climate plan for it both being ambitious and achievable and accountable. And you may have heard the BC former Green Party leader Andrew Weaver saying earlier this week that this is the plan I've been dreaming of for most of my life. So I think that we have in the Liberal Party of Canada a good continuation of the recent substantial investments. It's ambitious. I'm jumping into this for my children and for my grandchildren, and because I believe Yukon can be a leader in environmental protection and climate change action. And I want to be part of the solution, and I hope I can get your support to work together on these solutions as Yukon's MP. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was Dr. Brendan Hanley from the Liberal Party. And next we'll have Jonas Smith running as an independent. Closing remarks.
Yes, thank you for everyone for the opportunity to be here. Famed British poet and historian Robert Conquest, his first law of politics is everyone is conservative about what they know best. And I think that the environmental movement is a prime example of that, hence the term conservation. And conservation means many things to different people, but for me, my rule of thumb is the concept of not using any more than you have to. And so that's what I apply when I hunt and fish and teach my children to gather natural foods and medicine and to be responsible and respectful of our environment. And I know that many Yukoners prioritize a healthy world through a healthy diet and lifestyle, and that you know what's best for your families. And I just wanted to mention that I know some Yukoners have chosen not to get vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And in fact, there's thousands and thousands of Yukoners who've made that choice. And these are our family members, our friends, our coworkers. We all know them, we care for them. And I don't believe that they should be excluded from our society. So I'm the only candidate who supports your right to choose, to make your own decisions about your body. All other candidates and their parties support some form of coercion or discrimination. And so while people who've tuned in tonight might not agree with everything I've had to say on other matters, but if bodily autonomy and informed consent are important to you, I'm the only choice in this election. And I've dedicated over a decade of my life to politics. In my experience, it's not something you just jump into at the last minute and on a wing and a prayer and scripted answers. I think that you need to have experience in order to be successful. And I believe that I've demonstrated my commitment and willingness to stand up to Ottawa for Yukoners. And Yukon elections are always very close. Every vote counts. So I'm asking you to vote for me and ask your family and friends to do so as well. So thank you again for your time tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Jonas Smith. Next, we have Lisa Volans-Leduc from the NDP party.
There's the unmute button. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Our planet is in a state of emergency, whether we choose to say so or not. The NDP has a plan to tackle the climate crisis. I just actually received an email from a young climate activist telling us that Jacquard's data is inaccurate. Our Our plan to tackle the crisis is by taking climate leadership and getting to net zero, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, by creating good jobs in all regions. We'll create over 1 million new good jobs by investing in clean energy, building green infrastructure, and requiring the use of Canadian-made steel, aluminum, wood products for infrastructure projects, by improving where we live and work. New Democrats will set a target to retrofit all buildings by 2050 and provide supports to help families and communities meet this goal. We will create a national crisis strategy plan to help communities prepare for extreme weather and mobilize young people to lead the way by creating a civilian climate corps. By changing how we get around, we will help Canadians have access to greener transportation options. By powering our communities carbon-free, establishing a new Canadian climate bank that will invest in renewable energy, low carbon tech, and made in Canada manufacturing for green technology. By protecting our land and water, we will create a Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights that enshrines the right to a healthy environment. We will pursue a nature agenda that reverses species loss, safeguards biodiversity, and protects 30% of Canada's land, fresh water, and oceans by 2030, working in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. By working together in partnership with Indigenous peoples, New Democrats have built reconciliation into the heart of our plan to address the climate crisis. If we don't do something to protect the planet, we won't be addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls' calls to justice. This is integral, so integral in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Valence Leduc from NDP. Next, we will hear the closing remarks from Lenore Morris, Green Party.
So there's a lot of environmental issues that are really important, but the one that is the most pressing right now on the planet is climate change. And we've had climate change already. So we're currently approximately 1 degree above the original temperature 200 years ago. Our current goal as a planet is 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've broken that down. Individual countries have made commitments. Canada's made a series of commitments. Their current commitment is a 40% reduction of greenhouse gases from 2005 levels by 2030. And I did mention earlier, the Canadian government, whether it was the Conservatives or the Liberals, so far have never met a single target. At the moment, our target, our 40% target, we are 1% of the way there. We are not making progress at all. I know that because I can look at the Liberal government created a climate change ministry, which has really good information. Their own information is that they are not on track to meet their targets. The International Panel on Climate Change has told us over and over again that new oil and gas development is not consistent with our 1.5 degrees Celsius cap, and yet our government is in fact growing both our oil and gas industries. I'm an environmentalist. I know that it's mostly environmentalists are watching. Elect an environmentalist if this is what is important to you. I can be a real check and a balance on the government. I can be the person who challenges, the person who questions, the person who holds the government's feet to the fire. The government's made promises. I can help them meet those promises.
Great, thank you, Lenore Morris. Great, so we've come to an end of the closing remarks. Thank you all so much for all of your insightful answers. And now I would like to introduce you all to Coral Voss from the Yukon Conservation Society. Coral?
Thanks, Angela. I'm just wanting to thank everyone. I'm Coral Voss. I'm the Executive Director of Yukon Conservation Society. We're co-hosting with CPAWS Yukon. So I just wanted to spend a second to thank everyone at Yukon Conservation Society, Chris Ryder, and everyone at CPAWS Yukon, to thank the candidates for their time, their perspectives, and our moderator, Angela, especially after all the computer problems. So thank you, and thank you for overcoming those. And lastly, and certainly not least is the public for your attention, your questions, and your time to be here this evening. So a quick reminder that the recording of this forum will be available on both YCS's site and CPAWS Yukon, and as well as on our YouTube channels. So after that, I just wish everyone a lovely evening. And again, thank you for everyone being here. Have a good evening.
Thank you.